today to with Rabbi Yoffie, Rabbi Kroloff, to have a conversation a little bit about an update about what is happening in Israel and Gaza and the West Bank. I know that for many of us, this has been a challenging 9 days. It seems like it has been a lot longer. And to share what we are doing this morning, this afternoon, Rabbi Yoffie is going to share a little bit about how the situation has unfolded, what is happening on the ground, and the ever-changing things even from this morning. Rabbi Kroloff is going to talk a little bit about the politics on the ground in America and how that has played into this. And then I'll share a few reflections about how this has affected our own community, our college students as well. And then we'll open it up for questions and conversation. And then we'll finish up. We'll be done around 1 o'clock. But as we always gather, I always think it's important to really mark a moment like this that unfortunately we have to have these conversations with a prayer. So important to understand that while prayers don't always work, they kind of center us. And what is our hopes, what is our dreams, what is our desires for the land of Israel? And that is something that these prayers do. And I've been searching for the right words, and other people have shared poems. And so this morning I want to share a poem from a prayer for peace from Rabbi Naomi Levy. God, our hearts are breaking. Our brothers and sisters in Israel crouch in fear as sirens pierce the air and rockets from Gaza rain down from the sky. We pray that all Israelis, Jews, and Arabs will live in peace. We pray for the day the riots in the streets of Israel will give way to the sounds of children praying, when hate will be healed and the sounds of sirens will give way to songs of hope. We are all God's children, and in God's light we are all one. We pray there be no more violence or bloodshed within Israel, and we pray that Israelis and Palestinians will find a path to peace. Hear our people's prayers, and hear the prayers of innocent civilians in Gaza who share a longing for an end to this conflict. God, watch over Israel, over all our brothers and sisters who live there. Spread your shelter of peace over the Holy Land and all its inhabitants. Bring peace, God. Let it rain down from the heavens like a mighty storm. Let it wash away all hatred and bloodshed. Peace, God. Please, God. Amen. And so I think Rabbi Levy really, for me, brings the idea of our emotions are struggling. We are challenged by the situation. We are mourning, we are sad, we are scared. And I think her poem also helps us to understand that we desire peace, and how do we get there? And how do we perhaps end the current situation as well? And so I'm going to turn it over to Rabbi Yoffie, and I just want to thank Rabbi Yoffie for always saying yes to us, to share his wisdom, his insights into the current situation, for being a wonderful member of our temple family. So Rabbi Yoffie.
Okay, thank you, Rabbi Prosnit. Thank you for those words, which are an appropriate setting as we immerse ourselves in the details of this terrible period. Israel is in the midst right now of 4 crises: crisis of Hamas in Gaza, the crisis of Jerusalem, the crisis of relations with Israeli Arabs, and the crisis of occupation in the West Bank. And on the one hand, they're all related. Some Israelis make the mistake of thinking that Palestinians in one place don't care about Palestinians in another place. And this is not true. And the strike today in Israel and the territories is certainly proof of that. And yet, on the other hand, each crisis is in some ways distinct and separate. Now, the most urgent is Gaza. What is happening in Gaza? Hamas is an Islamic fundamentalist group that rules Gaza. It has shown virtually no concern for the welfare of its own people. Its goal is to establish itself as the leader of the Palestinians, to overthrow Israel, and to establish in its place an Islamic State. It carries on ongoing low-level warfare against Israel, firing missiles into nearby communities. And from time to time, it ups the ante and engages in major attacks. And in the 14 years of Hamas's rule, this is the fourth major war between Hamas and Israel. Israel responds to this by imposing a partial blockade to prevent weapons from getting into Gaza or being manufactured there. But Israel hasn't succeeded here. Hamas gets its missiles from Iran. They're sent to Syria and Lebanon, and then by boat to the Sudan. And they are smuggled then through the Sinai and into Gaza via the Hamas tunnels. So Hamas is always looking for opportunities to assert its leadership, and using religious tension to incite against Israel is the best way to do that. Hamas wants to turn the Israeli-Palestinian conflict into a religious war between Judaism and Islam. And Ramadan, when tens of thousands of Muslims come to pray at the Al-Aqsa Mosque in Jerusalem, is always a time to try and unsettle things. And every year during Ramadan, Hamas tries to lure Israel into a confrontation. Now this year, Israel, through, unfortunately, fumbling and incompetence, helped them along. When worshipers started throwing rocks, instead of acting with restraint, the Israeli police, who usually know better, entered the mosque and fired stun guns. That happened, I remember going, oh, not the right thing to do. Also, there is what euphemistically has been called a real estate dispute in East Jerusalem, involving the attempted eviction of Palestinian families from their homes. We don't have time to go into the details. Let's just say that this is not Israel's finest hour. These people are being discriminated against, and there are very good reasons why they should not be evicted from their homes. We can talk about it more during questions if we have a chance. So with all of this as background, Hamas saw an opening. They had built up their missile arsenal. They could present themselves as champions of the evicted families and as defenders of Jerusalem, and most of all, as defenders of Islam and Al-Aqsa. And with that as their platform, they began to launch missiles into Israel. Now, let's be clear, I've been honest about Israel's mistakes, and they were mistakes, and there were other mistakes made as well. But to Hamas, these mistakes were a pretext. And if they didn't exist, another pretext would have been found. So this was about Hamas asserting itself, claiming Palestinian leadership, and doing everything it could to kill Israelis and disrupt life in Israel. And disrupt life they did. So please, any notion of equivalence here is absurd and insulting. There's no justification whatever for Hamas's actions, period. We're talking about more than 3,000 missiles fired in a little over 10 days, every one aimed at civilians. We're talking about attacks not only on the communities in the periphery of Gaza, but on Jerusalem and Tel Aviv with far more sophisticated missiles than in the past. We're talking about closing down half of the country and millions of Israelis forced to flee to shelters. We're talking about a disruption of national life that no civilized democratic country in the world would tolerate for a single day, not one day. So some people and some commentators talk about the missiles flying into Israel as if they were, an unfortunate inconvenience. These are people who have never lived in a country under attack and have never sat in a shelter while bombs and missiles are falling around you. Something, sadly, I must say, that I have done in Jerusalem. Israelis, including left-wing Israelis, almost all support this war because they know whatever they think about the broader political issues and the inadequacies of their own government, and they don't like their own government very much, Hamas is committed to terror and threatens them and their children. They know that in their Middle Eastern neighborhood, in the absence of deterrence against the likes of Hamas, you are likely to end up dead. So how did Israel respond? By targeting Hamas leaders who had declared war on the Jewish state again, by targeting the underground tunnels where the leaders live and work, And this most of all, when someone is shooting missiles at you, the only way to stop the missiles is to take out the missile launchers. And so that's what Israel has tried to do. But what happens if the missile launchers are located in civilian areas? What happens is that you kill civilians, no matter how hard you try not to. Obviously, no one should be killing civilians. But can Israel sit back and let the missiles continue to rain down on Tel Aviv and Jerusalem and Ashkelon and Ashdod and so on? And the answer to that is impossible. It's just impossible. Now, a ceasefire is coming. It must come soon. And every civilian death and every child's death rends the heart. But Hamas is a terrorist group. It kills people in the name of God. It is evil. So my position is clear. I support Israel as it takes on Hamas and as it struggles with the very difficult questions of this conflict. And one more point. All of this was happening as it was transpiring. Riots by Arab Israelis broke out in the mixed city of Lod, which is near the airport, and then later in Haifa and Jaffa and other mixed cities. Mixed cities are simply places where there are large numbers of Jewish Israelis and Arab Israelis living together. Now, altogether, throughout Israel, there are about 1.8 million Arab Israelis. They are full citizens of the Jewish state. We're talking about the territories here. So why did these riots happen? Now, on the one hand, there's a very substantial Arab middle class in Israel. Maybe you've seen the numbers. 45% of Israeli pharmacists are Arabs. 25% of Israeli nurses are Arabs. 15% of Israeli doctors are Arabs. The whole health system is built on a core of Arab professionals. But there are also problems, serious problems, and some systematic discrimination. Arabs have trouble getting building permits for homes, for example. And most important, in recent years, there's been a crime wave in Arab areas, shootings and violence at far higher levels than in Jewish cities. And the police have done very little, despite the cries of Arab leaders for help. And remember that in Israel, the police force is not local, it is national. So, not surprisingly, when you have too many Arab criminals and thugs who've been ignored by the police, perhaps because they're bothering Arabs and not Jews, eventually they're going to start attacking the Jews too. And that's what happened. Arab thugs in Lod and in Haifa and elsewhere used the occasion of the war and the evictions and the shooting into the mosque to riot and to attack Jews in synagogues and Jewish areas. And while the number of people involved is small, there is no question that many in the Arab middle class felt anger and frustration about their own situation and their own sense of abandonment by Israel's government, as well as a certain identification with the suffering of Palestinians everywhere. And to this must be added the fact that there were not only Arab thugs involved, there were also Jewish thugs who roamed the streets before, during, and after these riots, doing rioting of their own, calling out death to the Arabs in the process. Summary and conclusion. First, Israel deserves our support during this conflict, and Hamas must be, if not defeated, then at least deterred, because otherwise there will be no peace in the Middle East and there will be no future for a Jewish state. Second, when the conflict is over, and God willing, it will be soon, Israel must come up with a plan, a real plan for what to do in Gaza, and must be prepared to be both more conciliatory than it's been, and if needed, tougher than it's been. What is clear is that this cycle of constant missile attacks leading to bigger attacks, leading to war, leading to humanitarian crisis, leading to ceasefire, and then back to the beginning, it can't go on. And third, beginning immediately, Israel must make peace between Arab and Jewish Israelis, arresting the thugs on both sides, holding them accountable, and treating them equally before the law. And more important, ending discrimination, building bridges, promoting understanding between Israel's majority and minority. Israelis know, I believe, that only if Israel makes peace at home will it ultimately be able to make peace with its neighbors. And then finally, Israel must initiate serious talks with the Palestinian Authority and show a willingness to stop settling and to move toward a two-state solution. Why is Hamas, which is extreme and fundamentalist, becoming more popular among Palestinians? And the answer, at least in part, is because the PA is seen as, the Palestinian Authority is seen as unable to deliver any progress on ending the occupation. Now, Hamas must be fought militarily. It made that very clear, but it also must be fought politically. And one of the best strategies for Israel would be to build up the credibility of the PA by initiating negotiations on a peace settlement. And ultimately, for this to happen, both the PA and Israel are probably going to need new leadership. Almost every prayer in the Jewish liturgy talks about peace, every major prayer. Take a look. If Israel wants peace, and it does, it will have to be very tough and also very smart. So, Rabbi Prosnit, I turn it back to you.
Thank you, Rabbi Yoffie. You have a way that you're able to teach us this complex challenges that we've faced the past 9 years in such a clear way. And so I thank you for your insight and your wisdom. And I've already jotted down the questions that I want to ask you, so we'll do that in a few moments. But I want to turn it over to Rabbi Kroloff to really talk about what we've been seeing a little bit on the ground here in America as well.
Thank you, and good to see you all. I want to thank Eric again for this and the many, many contributions that he's made over not just years, but decades, of course, to Jewish life in general, but to our congregation. What a treasure. What a treasure. You all realize how fortunate we are that Eric lives down the street from a lot of us, and certainly from me. And we saw each other yesterday, and that he is so accessible and accommodating with his time, and he never turns us down, right? So thanks, Eric, for being who you are and your marvelous analysis today. So last Thursday, I was doing whatever, and I had a phone call from one of our grandsons, who's a co-president of his Hillel in Ithaca, and it said, "I'm here with a couple of my friends, and we're just trying to figure out what's going on. Can we talk about Al-Aqsa and about the real estate in Jerusalem and on and on?" He said, I'm under attack. I'm president of Hillel, and they want to know why I'm a Zionist. How can you be a Zionist? Because Zionism equals racism. And that's what's going on. I think Rabbi Prosnit's going to say something about college students as well, but I share this because when your grandson calls you in the middle of the day and wants you to sit down with his friends, you know it's serious, and it's reached the kishkas, if you will, of American Jews. Now, Israel's enjoyed deep and broad bipartisan support in the United States. Republicans, Democrats, Christian evangelicals, and Jews who, despite our 2% numbers, wield a outsized influence in America. And that support for Israel is important. It must continue, and we need to be part of that support network for Israel in the United States. If not we Jews, then who? And as Eric said today, as he said so often, we can be critical. We can be unhappy about certain aspects of even the sparks that set this off, this crisis, but we are the support for Israel in the United States. Now, in 2014, the last conflagration between Israel and Gaza, some of the same things were happening, some of the same troubling issues that Eric referred to, but support for Israel snapped back pretty well. The question that is often asked is this time different? Is this time different? Now, don't get me wrong. The United States has a strategic alliance with Israel, and that's not going to change. And Israel is the only democracy in the Middle East, and Hamas is a terrorist organization, and that's not changing. And yet, in the last 7 years, there's been a tectonic change in the United States and in the world. Just as an anecdote, hashtag Black Lives Matter has morphed into hashtag Palestinian Lives Matter. Now, that phrase did not have the impact 4 or 5 years ago that it has today, for reasons that I don't have to explain to this group. Police brutality and immigration issues resurface now with a not just a flavor, but an impact that is very different from what it was even a few years ago. And social media, big in 2014, is enlarged in so many ways. And then in the United States, there is what's called the progressive wing of the Democratic Party, which includes the Squad, includes a growing number of individuals who are extremely critical of Israel and who really take an unbalanced view, including, I might say, Bernie Sanders in his op-ed piece in the Times a few days ago. And then there's an issue called intersectionality. It's a strange word, and it has to do with kind of a litmus test that has been applied. If you want to join climate change advocacy organizations, you sometimes have to pass a litmus test that you have to be on the same page with us on Palestinian rights, etc. And that's had an impact. And 150 advocacy organizations signed on to a petition that was critical of Israel. Now, many of you read the New York Times, and there have been a couple of strange columns there, some very good ones, but a couple of strange ones. Nick Kristof, whom I liked very much on most issues, said, "We don't have much influence over Hamas, so we have to put pressure on Israel." That's a pretty accurate summary. It's almost a direct quote of a recent column. Peter Beinart wrote a piece a few days ago that sounded like he composed it on another planet. Just amazing. He wrote in this setting, on their untapped resources of magnanimity and goodwill among Arabs. Now, that may have been the case, and that may be the case down the line, but he used that as an argument for advocating return of large numbers of Arab refugees back to Israel. He didn't use numbers, but he was talking about not hundreds or thousands or thousands, but tens of thousands and hundreds of thousands. And that's just an unrealistic, totally strange issue to bring up today, even though I recognize that Arab refugees is an issue among the Arabs, but that's not the way to go. Now, the Biden administration has been pretty much ignoring the Middle East in the first few months, hoping that it'll just stay calm. The re-entering the nuclear deal with Iran and domestic issues are far more important to the Biden administration. They were, but that's not going to be possible now, and they will have to address that. So in conclusion, Well, let me just note the Pew survey that just came out, another very interesting Pew survey. 2/3 of American Jews over 65 feel emotionally attached to Israel. 48% of Jewish adults under 30 do not have that. Only 48% have that feeling. It's still a very strong sense of commitment among American Jews to Israel, although it is slipping. We Jews, as Eric said, need to express ourselves to the administration, I think in letters to the editor, in conversations with our children and with our grandchildren. And it all needs to begin with strong support for Israel. And there are places and there are organizations and addresses that you all know that we should read and explore and consider supporting. They would include J Street and APAC and the New Israel Fund. I hope that we will all can become and continue to be strong supporters of a two-state solution. Before 9 days ago, most people were saying that two-state solution is not even a dream anymore. I wonder whether that has to be revisited, and is not this a possible time for focus on two-state solution, because God help us and God help Israel if there is not courageous initiative toward peace between Jews and Arabs, both domestically and on the larger scene.
Thank you, Rabbi Kroloff, for that analysis and those reflections. Truly, I cherish our partnership and our friendship to really help navigate a synagogue during these times. And so Rabbi Kroloff has been my wise mentor, as well as my someone that I always turn to for guidance. So I thank you. I do want to kind of touch upon, we've started Israel, North American, America. Now, I want to talk about this community for just a few moments, because I think it's really critical to hear what's happening in our synagogue, and the emails I've received, the relationships that we have built, because I think that shows the complexity of this moment in our synagogue life, as well as in America and Israel as well. First off, we've been in close touch with our shlichim and members of our temple community who are currently living in Israel. So many of you know Danielle and Michael and Lavi. They've been with us for over the past 7 years, and as they we've emailed back and forth just to check in to make sure that how they're doing and their families are doing. Lavi has had to go into a bomb shelter in Jerusalem when they were having dinner out. He shared with me, and had to get up from their dinner and go down. It's post-COVID times, basically, in Israel, so they're out and about and had to run downstairs quickly. Michael's further up in the north, and so hasn't had those experiences as of yet. And Danielle shared that she is safe with her family. Reached out to Ben Bass as well, Charlotte Gelfan's grandchild, just to check in. And I think it's really important for us, for people to know that we are concerned about them here in America, to make sure that they are safe. As Rabbi Yoffie said, even many of the most liberal Jews of our community in Israel feel strongly about making sure Hamas is attacked and they don't have the power to shoot rockets into Israel. And that's a conversation that we've had. When we sent out a letter about a week ago, I got a lot of feedback. Some saying, thank you. Others saying, why didn't you call out Palestinian terrorists more? Why didn't you stand more strongly with Israel? Others saying, why didn't you stand more strongly with Palestinians, the innocent people living in Gaza? And why didn't you have, why didn't you say more about that humanitarian needs of Gaza and be more critical of Israel? Our synagogue community is diverse. And I want to make sure that we know that. We, as a community, strongly believe that Israel has the right to defend itself. We also believe as Jews and as Israelis, we have to have a high moral compass that we need to be a light unto the nation. And at times that is challenging when we defend ourselves. And I know that this community is diverse in their thinking. And so I want to make sure that we kind of navigate that together. And that's one reason why we are here today, to have that conversation. Too often it's not a conversation. Too often it is, as we've seen, viral email chains or yelling at each other or not listening to each other. And around Israel, that is hard to listen and to not think someone is right or someone is right. And that only is separating us even more, which I am concerned about. I'm also concerned about our college students. I've received more emails about what the current situation in Israel than any other thing that in my past time here at Temple, from many different people, from concerned grandparents to concerned parents to our teens and our college students. At the very beginning of this, someone reached out who's at Carnegie Mellon. They have a fence there that they paint. Different groups can paint it, celebrating engineering, celebrating a win for a team. And one of the students had shared a picture with me that says Israel is an apartheid state. And she felt extremely attacked as a Jew, and she reached out to the administration and Hillel. And at first, she didn't get any response. And then I was so glad that she reached out to our synagogue as a place of resource for her. What should she do? I connected her with the AJC in Pittsburgh, and who has people on campus in Pittsburgh to really have a conversation, to foster a conversation with her and Hillel, and what is the right response? What can they do? How can she feel safe on her college campus? That has happened on more than one occasion this past week. People asking, how do we talk to our children? What do we say? What are the resources we have? And I'm going to share some resources in just a bit as well. For us, this is a time where we need to support Israel. We need to say that Israel does have the right to defend itself. But I also want to be able to navigate together other emotions that we have. How do we say that innocent Gazans, how do we say a prayer for them as well, right? How do we do that? Some people have told me we shouldn't be doing that. And I push back and say, of course, we believe in human life. We need to make sure that life is sacred, and how do we continue to have that conversation? And so for the next 10 minutes or 15 minutes or so, we want to open up that conversation a little bit with more questions for Rabbi Yoffie, Rabbi Kroloff. And if you wanted to put in the chat box, I can monitor that chat box a little bit. But I do want to start, Rabbi Yoffie. You didn't touch upon the elections in Israel, both for the called off Palestinian elections, as well as the void of forming a government in Israel. So I was hoping that maybe you could touch upon that a little bit, about why do you feel that that was one other reason that this kind of was engulfed of the violence recently? Is this a political move?
Well, the political situation is very complicated, and again, you can't possibly try and analyze all of it. I will say this, that in Israel, they were trying to put together a government, what was called the government of change, a non-Netanyahu government that consisted of parties across the spectrum that opposed the current prime minister. And they were looking at the possibility of including an Arab party in this coalition. That was a hugely important step because it's never happened before in Israel's history. And it was a statement by Israeli Arabs that as on the one hand, as bad as things were, they recognized they needed to enter into the political system. They needed to be a part of it. And there was a willingness for the first time on the part of the Jewish parties to say, well, maybe it was because of desperation to get Netanyahu out, but nonetheless, they were open to this possibility. So while there were a whole variety of reasons why Hamas did what it did, and it mostly focused on the issue of Al-Aqsa, one of their motivations unquestionably was they wanted to destroy the option of creating an Israeli government that included an Arab party, because that would mean that the Arabs were being integrated into Israeli society and into a world that's dominated by Jewish groups. Their whole premise is that is by definition impossible. So once you had a reality that was actually happening, it would undercut who they are and their fundamental platform. And they realized that if a war was happening, that neither on the Jewish side nor on the Arab side would this kind of cooperation be possible. And in fact, they were right. They were right. That's exactly what they ended up accomplishing. So we have to despair that this opportunity was lost. And we have to hope that in the future, I mean, again, there are many, many possibilities. We couldn't possibly discuss them here. That one of the options, once again, will be bringing Jews and Arabs together in some kind of a government coalition. That's what we all hope for, and that really will be the only way to sort of complete this process of integration that at least very tentatively had been begun.
Thank you. If you have questions, I have a couple here in the chat box, but if you want to unmute yourself, you're more than welcome to it. I can't see everyone, so just know that. I see Jean's hand though.
Yeah, Eric, I'm curious as to your reaction to Thomas Friedman's op-eds, the last two, and particularly his second one. How do you view a defeat of Hamas or marginalization of Hamas? What does that look like in terms of going forward?
What does it mean to defeat Hamas? Is that the question?
Yeah, what does that look like? A defeat of Hamas or a marginalization of Hamas?
Again, a very big question, and the fact is that Israel needs a strategy to defeat Hamas, and it hasn't had a strategy. We just have this cycle, as I said, that repeats itself over and over and over again. So my own view is I agree with those Israelis who say that part of the reason that Hamas succeeds and part of the reason that it continues to go to wars, there's absolutely nothing to lose. I mean, Hezbollah, for example, has more in the north, has more missiles than Hamas has, but you've had quiet on the northern border since 2006. And the reason is that you do have a functioning society in Lebanon, as imperfect as it is, with an infrastructure and so on. And they know that if there's a war, Israel will destroy that infrastructure, and there'll be a terrible cost. And Hezbollah feels a certain responsibility in that regard, not to Israel, but to its own people, and knows it will be held responsible. Those dynamics don't exist in Gaza because there is no infrastructure. There's nothing. Now it's basically their own fault because there has to be a blockade because they are declaring war against Israel and they're using resources to build weapons. So maybe what has to happen now is Israel, together with the United States, and a number of Israelis have made these proposals, including Israelis on the right, not only on the left, saying we have to offer them lifting the blockade, recreating their economy, building a harbor, for example, which would serve as the basis of the economy. And in return, what we will ask for is not that they recognize us and make peace, because that's not going to happen. Everybody understands that. But there has to be a permanent ceasefire, and it has to be monitored. And if they're prepared to enter into a permanent ceasefire, stop all terror and all missiles, we'll lift the blockade and help them build an economy. My own view is that Israel should do that together with America and the other great powers, and it should be seen by the world as a positive step forward, which it would be. You know, and again, a number of plans for that. Now, would Hamas say yes to that? And the answer is, it's not at all clear that they would. It's not at all clear that they would, that they're prepared even for that level of acceptance of Israel. But if the plan were put forward, at least they would be, you know, displayed to the world as you know, true rejectionists, absolutely unprepared to do anything for their own people. So that's the first thing that I would say. And the second thing, and this is going to sound harsh because it is harsh, but let's say such a proposal is made, and once again they say no, and they continue with their firing their missiles into Israel. And by the way, you know, what makes this particularly serious in the most recent conflict is that missiles are being fired into Jerusalem and Tel Aviv. What that means is we have gotten used to the fact that they fire missiles every week into the communities in the periphery and into Ashdod and Ashkelon. That's not acceptable. That should never have been acceptable. But if they absolutely reject every proposal set forward, there are military people in Israel who said over the last week, it's very interesting, you know, they've always opposed in the past a military campaign to go into Gaza and topple Hamas. First of all, because it would involve a lot of casualties on both sides. And second of all, you topple Hamas, it's not clear what you're going to get. But there are military leaders who are saying if they absolutely refuse any kind of proposal to bring an end to this violence in return for, you know, benefiting their own people, maybe Israel really will have no choice. And maybe they will have to go into Gaza and topple the Hamas regime and take their chances on who might replace them in the hopes that some kind of peace or understanding might be possible. So for now, that's not a great answer, but there aren't a lot of great answers, and it's the best I can do.
Thank you. Other questions before I go to the chat box? Questions about, Susan, did you have your hand up? Sorry.
I joined late, so I apologize if this has been covered, but I have a question for Rabbi Yoffie. What are your feelings about the support or lack thereof of the other Arab countries for Israel at this time? I don't know if you talked about that earlier, and I apologize, but given the progress that was made, you know, with recent pacts with the other Arab countries, they don't appear to be stepping up. It's all, I mean, it's like there's a silent pact or something with respect to Israel. Could you address that if you didn't already? Thank you.
Well, the question of the Abraham Accords and how does this, you know, play out in the current situation? Look, the response of the Arab countries, I would say, is not bad. In other words, you really had to be an idealist to think in this situation that the Arab countries would come forward and embrace Israel and applaud what they were doing. That just isn't realistic given their own political realities and you know, whatever sentiments exist on the Arab street. So, you know, the issue would be, despite the Abraham Accords, would they come out with strong, vicious attacks on Israeli actions and so on? And the truth is that hasn't happened either. So on balance, I don't think Israel has done too badly in that regard. Having said that, if the conflict continues, I think clearly there's reason for concern, and there's a number of commentators have said, including some who aren't too positive towards Israel, but you know, nonetheless, might be right on this point. It was always an illusion or a delusion, really, to think that the Abraham Accords meant that the rest of the Arab world would simply set aside the Palestinians no matter what happened on the ground. And they would say, we absolutely positively don't care. And whatever goes on there, we're simply going to be quiet and go about our own business. The truth is that there's going to have to be progress on the Palestinian front. Israel needs it. I've already said that you need to create an alternative to Hamas. That's an immediate reason to do so. But the truth is, the Arab world does feel a tie. They do feel a connection. There's truly a deterioration on the Palestinian front, both in the West Bank territories and in Gaza. Ultimately, the Arab countries are going to respond in not a positive way. So we have to be realistic at that. Thankful for the Abraham Accords. They're holding up reasonably well, but nonetheless, a way has to be found to move forward on the Palestinian question.
Thank you.
A question a little bit about the current strike that's happening this morning, or I guess this afternoon. Currently, it feels like that the Palestinians are coming together. I don't know if this is only a one-day strike, but there seems like there is a momentum that we haven't seen perhaps before. And so the question, do you see that momentum? And as well as a concern for, is there going to be a third intifada? Is that something that Israelis are nervous about on the ground?
Look, the Palestinian strike, we don't know, is it going to be a one-day event and then tomorrow we go back to business as usual, or is it going to indicate a new trend and a new unity among the various factions of the Palestinian population? The latter possibility is Israel's nightmare. It's truly Israel's nightmare. If they say what we're currently hearing, that we're all one, we Palestinians are all one people. We all share in the suffering and concern for any Palestinian who is suffering anywhere, whether it's in the territories or whether it's in Jerusalem or whether it's in Gaza, or whether it's within Israel itself. What that leads to, and what people are already saying is, and Rabbi Kroloff mentioned this, demands for a single state. That the only way to deal with all of this suffering and all these different situations is to create a single state in which we'll all be part of the same reality. And on the one hand, the language is Jews and Arabs will all have equal rights. Everybody will have one vote. And, the suffering of Gaza will end and the suffering in the West Bank will end and so on. And we'll live together in a single state. That's the rhetoric. The reality is going to be different. If there's a single state, it's going to be an Arab state. You look at the demographics and there's simply no question. The single state is going to be an Arab state. Jews are going to be a minority in that state. And anybody who thinks that a single state in Palestine, in which Jews are a minority, is going to be a good place for Jews to live and for the destiny and future of the Jewish people is crazy. It's just crazy. So that's why we need a two-state solution, as Rabbi Kroloff said. If there is no two-state solution, there is no solution, at least not one that's acceptable to the Jews and that meets the needs of the Jewish people. You need a state with a Jewish majority, and that means finding a way to create a Palestinian state, end the occupation, and ultimately Gaza, I rather suspect, will be an independent state. If it's ultimately part of a Palestinian state, well, so be it. Working that out, as we know, will be enormously difficult, enormously complicated. As difficult as it is still better than the alternative, which is a single state with a Jewish minority. Zionism was not about being a minority in somebody else's state. So we need to recommit ourselves to that, and that means doing the things that now we've all talked about. It means starting negotiations with the PA. It means dealing with discrimination with it in Israel. The most distressing aspect of this is if Israeli Arabs who are citizens of the state of Israel no longer feel that they really have a stake in the welfare of that state, and they want to join together with others outside of the state to create this new entity, that is a new and deeply distressing reality. So that has to be dealt with immediately by finding ways to meet their legitimate requests and also to put an end to violence that is not legitimate. So it's very troubling. We'll have to watch the strike very carefully. We'll have to see what develops from it. We'll have to draw appropriate conclusions.
So I just jump in here. Rabbi Yoffie has presented the two options. One is a single state, which I concur is prescription for disaster. The two-state solution, which he and I very strongly advocate. There's also a third option. And the third option is the reaction to this will be an Israeli government that will be more right-wing than ever, more nationalistic than ever, and more restrictive than ever on rights. That too is a prescription for disaster. Was it Churchill who said that democracy is a terrible form of government, but all the others are worse. So two-state solution in some eyes, has issues and is a reach, but all the others are worse. All the others are worse. So I would urge you all, as you think about what can we do, is to be as supportive as you can for the two-state solution option, which to find those organizations which advocate it, be an advocate yourself for it, and it's something also to talk to children and grandchildren about as well.
So we are about at time, and so I always want to end with some sign of hope or nechemta of the current situation, which is hard to find. Anything these past 9 days that provide you a little hope, or any ideas of when this will be over, or and I guess not over, but at least the current situation as well?
Well, look, I'm always inspired by the resilience and the strength of the Israeli people under these circumstances, and they do come together in struggles like this. They're able to separate out the issues, to understand you can favor peace and still believe that Hamas must be defeated and terrorists must be defeated. So I'm inspired by how I see Israelis responding now. What will happen next in the political realm, I don't know, but I haven't given up on the possibility that this will lead to a new government and a different government that will be more realistic about moving us out of the morass that we're in, dealing with the threats that come from the Arab side, but moving us forward towards peace. I haven't given up yet. Perhaps that possibility still exists.
Thank you.
I just add that sometimes in darkest hours, the seeds are there for hope and for new directions. So my hope and prayer is that as bad as this is, it'll be seen as an opportunity on the part of Israelis that I too still have great faith in, and the U.S. government. I think that the U.S. government has an opportunity here now, together with other friends of Israel, and you know who they are, to push forward. Neglect. I think it was Jeremy Ben-Ami who heads J Street. Neglect is not an option, and I think we were in a direction where neglect was the option of administration. It's not an option. So I'm hoping for opportunity here.
Yeah. And for me, last Thursday, we had an author, Youssef Bashir, Gaza. He grew up in Gaza. and wrote a book about his father. He was shot by an Israeli IDF soldier, and then he was taken care of in the Tel Aviv hospital, and then was able to relearn how to walk. And he taught us about forgiveness and taught us about that there are members in Gaza who believe that there is a chance for coexistence. We don't hear those voices. And we spoke to him right before this presentation and said, do you still want to do this? His family's still in Gaza. And they had just seen an explosion right near their home, he shared with us. But he said that this is even more important than ever to have these conversations with Jews and to share his story of how he lives his life. He's an American now. He hasn't been back. He's an American Palestinian. He became an American citizen. He hasn't been back to Gaza in over 10 years to see his family, but he believes that there is possible chance. We need to hear more of his voices. And that gives me some hope to hear different narratives as well. To read a book from him helped me see a different side of a story that I don't always see or hear. And so I find a little hope in that moment too.
I'd like to say thank you to Rabbi Prosnit for bringing diverse voices to Temple Emanu-El through this and so many other important programs. It's really become a model of what needs to be done. Thank you for that.
Thank you. I just want to thank Rabbi Yoffie, Rabbi Kroloff, and all of you for joining us today. I'm sorry that we have to gather to talk about this, but it's important as a community to really continue to learn, continue to hear, to continue to support a two-state solution, support our Israel as well. And so I want to make sure that we can continue to have these conversations at the temple. Please email me if you have ideas, but let's not have a conversation over email. I'd much rather sit in the temple tent or pick up the phone call. Going back and forth when we might disagree on some things is fine, but we're not gonna listen and we're not gonna hear. And I encourage you to do that with your family as well. Sending articles to each other is good. It's good to hear different points of view, but we're never going to hear a conversation. We're never going to listen if we don't come together and have that conversation. So hopefully that this is a beginning of our conversation. We pray for peace. We hope a ceasefire is in coming days as well, that we Israelis will not have to run down to bomb shelters, that innocent lives are not taken during this time. So thank you. I wish you all well. Be safe. And look forward to seeing you in person soon.
Thank you, Rabbi. Thank you.